And welcome to today's Lunch and Learn interview. Our guest today is Judge Fatima El-Amin. Judge El-Amin has been a full juvenile court judge in DeKalb County, Georgia since 2014. She's a very busy woman, and I'm deeply honored that she has agreed to carve out some time to be with us today. Some of you have submitted questions ahead of this interview, but you'll also have the option to write your questions in the chat. At the end of the interview, Ms. Rahma Abdel-Alim will choose from among the questions as many as we have time for. But before I dive into the interview, let me give you some background on Judge El-Amin. Judge Fatima El-Amin is a native of Atlanta, Georgia. She attended the W.D. Muhammad High School in DeKalb County and graduated as co-valedictorian of her class. Judge El-Amin completed her collegiate studies at Harvard University in Cambridge, Massachusetts, and graduated cum laude with a dual BA degree in psychology and Near Eastern languages and civilization. Her senior honors thesis is titled The Hijab, Investigating the Relationship Between Traditional Islamic Dress and Self-Esteem Among African American Muslim Women, received magna cum laude distinction at Harvard. Judge El-Amin returned to Atlanta, Georgia, and received her JD degree from Emory University School of Law in 2000. She was the recipient of the Emory Law School Dean's Public Service Award. Judge El-Amin's legal career began as an assistant district attorney in DeKalb County. In 2004, Judge El-Amin joined a private real estate practice in East Point, Georgia, and represented clients in commercial property disputes. A year later, Judge El-Amin returned to public interest law as a senior attorney in the DeKalb County Child Advocacy Center. She was promptly promoted to supervising attorney and was responsible for overseeing litigation and advocacy efforts on behalf of abused and neglected child clients. In April of 2014, the Superior Court judges of DeKalb County appointed Judge El-Amin as a full juvenile court judge. Judge El-Amin presides over dependency, delinquent, and traffic cases in juvenile court. She sits by designation in DeKalb County Superior Court. Ooh, dear Fatima, as you know, Karama's alumni come from all over the world and from many different Muslim cultures, and many of them are not aware of the history of Islam among the African-American community. So for example, I expect that many of them are not aware of the history of schools established by African-American Muslims. Could you please start by telling us a bit about the W.D. Muhammad School, when it was established, its mission, anything else you think would fill in that background?
All right. The school that I attended is actually, the elementary school was Clara Muhammad Elementary. The high school was later renamed to W.D. Muhammad High School. Mm-hmm. I attended that school from age 4 in pre-K all the way up through the 12th grade. And interestingly, my mother was a teacher at the school who ended up being the principal, and my father was the imam of the Atlanta Masjid community, which was responsible for the school, and he was therefore the director of the school. Mm-hmm. So that is why I was adamant about leaving the state of Georgia to go to college. I was like, okay, I've been sheltered and in this small insular community for way too long, and I was so excited to get away. Even though my great-grandmother and my aunts and my grandmother all went to Spelman College here in Atlanta. So a lot of people thought I was going to go to Spelman because
wonderful school.
But I wanted to get away. So the Muhammad Schools of Atlanta were reestablished in about 1980. There was, with the Nation of Islam, so I don't know if I'm going too far back, but just kind of as a just a quick cursory review, the Nation of Islam kind of was established by Wallace Fard Muhammad and then his pupil Elijah Muhammad back in the 1930s.
30s.
When Elijah Muhammad passed, his son Warif Deen Muhammad took over his community of the Nation of Islam in 1975. I incidentally was born in 1975. And so when I was born, my parents had already not only converted out of Christianity into Islam, but then they made that transition with Warif Deen Muhammad to more Orthodox Sunni Islam, as opposed to the Nation of Islam, which I think could be categorized more so as a Black power movement, is sort of how I describe it. So Clara Muhammad was Elijah Muhammad's wife and the mother of Warif Deen Muhammad. And the schools, there are Clara Muhammad schools all over the country. And Clara Muhammad was famously known for being committed to educating her children, not entrusting her children to people who did not look like them and to the public institutions. And so she was very particular about educating her own children. And so Sister Clara Muhammad School, the name, essentially pays homage to her and her commitment to educating her own children. And so in Atlanta, we reestablished it again right around 1980. That was just in time. My
for you.
Very instrumental in that movement because they had young children and they felt very strongly about their children having an Islamic education. And so we started off a very small school. At our peak, there were probably about, and this was the largest, or probably about 375 students from pre-K through 12th grade. So
wow.
That was at its largest. It has, it still remains a pretty small school. I had a child who attended, so after I graduated, then my son went for his formative years to the school. I also sat on the school board for a time. But that is kind of a quick overview. And then once, so as it started out, it was just elementary levels, and then we started adding a grade at each year. And
so you must have been just either in that leading edge class or maybe a year behind,
yes,
as they were building up.
Exactly. I was the second graduating class. I graduated from W.D. Muhammad High in 93. Our first class graduated in 92. And we always joke those two classes about, we got caught, we got stuck, because the classes ahead of us, of course, didn't. But I honestly, I say that facetiously, I actually had a wonderful experience in the Muhammad schools. It was strict. And again, because my parents were on campus pretty much every day, I didn't get away with much of anything, but it was actually a wonderful experience for me. So we extended a year every year until we got to high school. And once the high school was complete, they felt that the community wanted the high school to have a sort of male leadership and to aspire to the leadership of Imam W.D. Muhammad. So it was kind of like Clara Muhammad for the younger children, the nurturing mother. And then now that we're in high school, let's pay homage to Warif Deen Muhammad.
Well, it sounds like you had a wonderful time. I have a friend who established a Montessori school, a Waldorf school. And she was telling me how exciting it was to start adding classes year by year with the leading edge classes. There was a sense of being pioneers. So I think you must have had an absolutely amazing time growing up there.
And it was one of the, like I said, there were Sister Clara Muhammad schools all over the country. We were the first to have the high school, W.D. Muhammad School. And what was so exciting about it, I remember so many students being pulled out of the school. I remember close friends whose parents took them out of the high school because they were like, oh, we don't know how these kids are going to do. They're not getting they probably aren't getting a top rate education. And so they took them out and put them in local public schools. And so when that first class, the class ahead of me, started college admissions and their scholarships, then it was like, oh, and then, so we were going to all of the top schools. It didn't matter what school we applied to, we were getting accepted and getting scholarships. And so that really added to the euphoria, because then, okay, not only are we educating our own, but we're equipping them such that they can go out into other spheres and do well.
And be highly sought after,
Yes.
by all these big name schools, Annie. MashaAllah. It's a tribute to the dedication that first generation of parents, who were sometimes parents, teachers, had to creating something of real quality. Well,
absolutely.
I see that at university, like our dear Rahma Abdel-Alim, you decided to get a dual degree. So what was it that appealed to you about these two rather different fields of psychology and Near Eastern languages and civilization? I do note that your senior honors thesis manages to combine aspects of both fields of study. So could you talk a bit about what interested you in these fields of study, and also say a little bit about your findings in your thesis?
Okay, well, I will say when I was in high school, because it's sort of funny to go from W.D. Muhammad High School to Harvard. And it's funny because Clara Muhammad Elementary and W.D. Muhammad High School, there was always a lot of emphasis on African American studies and African studies. And so all of the readings that we had were generally by African American scholars and authors. When we studied world history, there was always an emphasis on African countries and leaders. And a lot of that had to do with the fact that our parents were of African American descent, and it was important for them. The whole reason why the school was open was because they wanted their children to have an education that reflected their own identities. So then when I got to Harvard, it was like a whole new world, like something as simple as Shakespeare and the chivalric romances. It was pretty foreign to me. Like everybody knew that like the back of their hand, but that was foreign to me. And so I say all that to say, I had a very focused primary education. It was very heavily slanted towards my own African American culture. And what I intended, in hindsight, and once I had been in college for a year, major that I really wanted to have had, but I just didn't have a broad enough scope of knowledge. I meant to major in sociology. That really was what I was trying to get to, but I didn't realize that. And so I thought psychology was the major that I wanted. And the parts of psychology that I most appreciated were social psychology. I really should have majored in sociology, but by the time I figured that out, I was too vested. I had too many credits in psychology and I couldn't afford to. And majoring in Near Eastern languages and civilizations was never something I went to school to major in, but in high school, Arabic was our foreign language. And so when I went to college, I wanted to continue that. And I had done, Arabic studies programs in Egypt and in Massachusetts for a summer. And so I wanted to continue that. And so every semester I was taking an Arabic course, and it was my advisor who said to me one day, "What's up with all these Arabic classes?" And I was like, well, it's my foreign language and I want to keep learning it. And Harvard had an exceptional Islamic studies department. And so, but it was called Near Eastern Languages and Civilizations. And I had also taken some other courses within that major. My advisor said, well, you're taking the courses anyway. Why don't you do a major and make it count? Since you're taking these courses randomly, why don't you be a dual major? And the only thing is, you'll have to do, if you want to graduate with honors, you'll have to do an honors thesis that combines both of your majors.
Aha.
So for me, having grown up as a Muslim woman, my father, like I said, was the imam. My parents were very strict growing up. And so I always had to cover from head to toe. And I think things are different nowadays with young Muslims growing up. But when I was growing up, a child born in the 70s, I had a lot of pride in my Islamic identity, but I also had some resentments and I had issues, and I felt like I didn't have any freedom. And so, again, why I was determined to get out of Georgia. And one of the refrains in my conversations and my experiences with my peers, having grown up in Atlanta, Georgia, was this whole issue of the hijab. And, it was always a thing about, does she cover, does she not cover, does she cover, does she not cover? And I felt like it was so big of an issue in the Muslim community, at least the one that I grew up in. And then when I left and went away to college, I always felt that over my head, like, am I representing enough? Like, I felt I had a different amount of pressure that perhaps my male Muslim counterparts did not have. And so when I was being a joint major and I knew I had to do an honors thesis combining my psychology degree with my Near Eastern languages and civilizations degree, and I know I have the type of personality, I can't do it well if it's not meaningful and important to me. And so I was like, I got it. I want to look at this whole issue, because the other thing that would come up when I was at Harvard and when I would go into different spaces outside of the insular community I was in, there was so much negative talk about the hijab, and at that particular time in the 90s, the hijab received a lot of focus, and it was, people did not have a very favorable view of the hijab. And even though I had struggled with it internally, I was still very protective of it and defensive of it. Even though I had my own personal issues and I would be mad, and sometimes I wanted to wear it, sometimes I didn't. I was very protective of the institution. And I also, from my own personal experience, did not see it as being something oppressive. Most of the Muslims I knew who covered were not oppressed and were not downtrodden in the way that outsiders often expect them or perceive them to be. And that is why I wanted to do how I ended up doing the honors thesis on the hijab and an investigation of self-esteem amongst African-American Muslim women who cover themselves in hijab. And because I wanted to look, I'm like, does it really have an impact on women's self-esteem? If a woman chooses or does cover, does that mean she has lower self-esteem or that she's harmed in some way? And it was a meaningful topic for me that I was really interested in. And my advisors, one of the things I always tell people about Harvard, people can say what they want to, but it was one of the most supportive, amazing experiences of my life. And I never, anytime I had an idea or I needed help, was always available and willing. And so my advisors were very supportive. And, we realized I had to narrow the focus. So I focused on African-American Muslim women in the Southeast. And I focused on that particular population for a couple of obvious reasons. Obvious, number one being accessibility. I sought out, I would go to the masajid and the mosque on Friday for Juvenile, to give out anonymous surveys to the women. And so because of where I'm from and because of the relationships, my own network, I knew that was the most accessible community for me, was African American Muslim community in the Southeast, because I lived. So when I would travel home, that's when I would go collect my data. The other reason, and of course, I'm an African American woman. So again, I like to do stuff that has a personal connection and that I can be passionate about. So, and the other reason at the time in the early 90s, when I did the thesis, the majority of the African American Muslim women population were people who chose to be Muslim. In other words, they weren't born into a Muslim family. So like now I was born to Muslim parents. At that time in the 90s, the majority of African American Muslim women had converted and had elected to be Muslim. And so to me, I wanted to look at that population also, because I think the results would be more telling and compelling. Because it's one thing if you cover or have certain beliefs simply because they were passed down to you. And I'm not saying that's the case per se, but I'm just saying, I think there is if your parents were Muslim, the likelihood that you're going to identify as Muslim will be greater.
Pretty high.
Than the contrary. Yeah. I wanted to look, that's why I looked specifically at African American Muslim women, because I knew I had to have a limited pool. I didn't have much time, I had
yeah, you weren't writing a tome, you were trying to write an honors thesis.
right. And so the interesting thing was there was ultimately the findings, there were no significant findings as to what, and before I say that, then I had to delve into this whole issue of what is the hijab, so we had to delve into that and distinguishing between dress and behavior, so on and so forth. Oh no, I could spend the whole time talking about this, but to get to the bottom line, the findings were there were no statistical significance in terms of women who covered in hijab and personal self-esteem, meaning how you see yourself as an individual. However, where the statistical significance came in was women who cover in hijab and their collective self-esteem. Self-esteem meaning how you view yourself within the framework of the group. So how do you feel? Are you happy and nurtured? And do you feel like you positively are connected to the group being the Muslim community? Again, no statistical significance between covering and how you feel by yourself as an individual. The women who covered in my particular study had much higher levels of collective self-esteem within the Muslim community. It was as if the covering made them prouder to Muslim. It made them feel like they were more connected to their own Muslim communities. I could talk about that forever, but that's.
Oh, I know. Hijab is such an amazing polyvalent sort of symbol, because it depends so much when you talk about its significance. Is it the significance to the woman wearing it? Is it the significance to the observer looking at her? Is it the significance to the group? It's, as you say, one could spend a lot of time talking about that. Yes. Absolutely.
And the findings changed based on if the woman felt like she was able to, that she chose to wear it by her own volition versus whether she felt pressured by her husband or her friends or her father or her community. And that women, the women who felt pressured and like they didn't really have a choice, had lower collective
self-esteem. Well, sure, they were being bullied, if you ask me. Well, right. This sounds amazing. So why, having spent so much time and done so much work on, in this area, why did you not continue towards a career in either of these fields? Or to put it another way, why choose law?
Well, I kind of refer to it, I call it the Cosby effect. And what I mean by the Cosby effect is this. I grew up watching The Cosby Show. And say what you want about the man, Bill Cosby, and everything that has transpired, but that television show was groundbreaking. Because it was one of the first times that young African-American children saw very successful, prominent parents who were together in a single household, raising children, dealing with some of the same issues that everyone else dealt with. And so for me, and for many of my friends, watching The Cosby Show kind of gave me, I felt like there were two paths. There were two paths for smart, successful Black kids. Either I was going to be a doctor or a lawyer. Both of the parents in The Cosby Show, one was a doctor, one was a lawyer. Right. And so for me, from that point on, once I started watching that show, I was like, oh, I'm gonna be somebody. I'm gonna be a doctor or a lawyer. And so when I first went to college, my plan was to be a pediatrician. And I was used to making all A's. I got to Harvard. I took my math class, and my first test, I think, was a D. And in that moment, I decided, and I was young and immature, I think I could have, just stuck it out. But in that moment, in 1993, I decided, I don't like math, and this is not for me, and I'm not going to subject myself to this for the next however many years. But
10 years, perhaps, if you were going to do a specialty.
Right. But I always was a great writer. And speaking was always stressed in my household. So I was like, I'll be a lawyer because I love to write and talk. And so it was as simple as that. It was nothing, I wish I could tell you, oh, I planned on saving the world and, blah, blah, blah. It was really as simple as that. I was either going to be a doctor or a lawyer. And then once I decided to go to law school, I did try to give, then I did have this idea that I would be an international lawyer. I interned in the courthouse, in the county juvenile court, and then in Fulton County DA's office, and the rest is history. I fell in love. I knew from being an intern in both of those offices that my comfort zone, the place that I came alive, was in the courtroom. I loved being a litigator. I loved giving opening statements and, speaking in front of a jury. And so after I had those experiences, I just kind of knew that was the path for me.
That's amazing. You missed an opportunity. We had this fantastic 6-month course where we started, and one of the reading Quran together as a group, and one of the ongoing discussions was, how do you know when you're on as-sirat al-mustaqim? Sounds like you got guidance, and you have definitely been on as-sirat al-mustaqim.
Well, I'll say, to be honest, I sort of feel like I kind of have that belief that, at least how it's been in my life, that's not to say I haven't had many disappointments in my life. I feel like no matter what path I take, Allah always guides me and helps me to be successful. And so, yeah, but I say that to say, I think it can look, so I don't want to give the impression that it was, and then once I got there, it was like straight ahead. And no, that's not realistic. Like, that life is, a friend once described this to me, as you just ride in the waves. You have to learn to ride the waves and have faith when you're down in the low points that you're going to rise again. And that
Mhm.
sort of is just, I think the only way to really be successful is just to know that the disappointments, the failures are gonna come. You know, I tell, and it's so funny, a lot of people, I have a lot of law students, for instance, and they're like, oh, I mean, you just went straight through and then you just ended up being a judge and you weren't even 40 years old. And I'm like, yeah, but there were about 4 or 5 judgeships that I applied for before I finally got it.
Mhm.
Even, and I tell the story all the time, my parents were some of the most amazing parents there were. They were always super supportive. But I remember telling my parents at 39 that the judgeship that I have today, was applying for it. I don't know if I think I must have been 39.
Mhm.
And my parents said to me, I just don't think you're gonna get it. You're not even 40 yet. Like, why don't you? Because I had just gotten another promotion in a whole
Yeah.
other, office, and my parents were like, just stick with that. Like, I don't think this is for you, and we don't want you to jeopardize getting that. You know, we don't want you to lose the promotion you just got because they find out you're trying to be a judge. And so I tell people that story all the time because I'm like, sometimes when you have a dream and there's something that you want to do, even your own family, the people who have been most supportive, they won't see it and they won't.
Yeah.
So you can't be discouraged. But I let us know all the time. I got rejected multiple times before I finally got the judgeship that I have, which is really the one that I should have had all along. That it's the one that's the best fit for me. So, you know.
And we can say that having had to struggle for it, perhaps you value it all the more. So,
Absolutely. And the other thing is, um, I like to emphasize the importance of struggle. And I tell
mhm.
this story, and you know, Rama knows this because she's one of my really good friends. I went through, I can't even remember what year it was now. Must have been about 15 years ago. One of the most awful divorces anyone can ever imagine. I mean, I know all divorces are bad, but this one was horrific in every way, and it almost destroyed me. And I went from, you know, always being very confident and being good with money and saving my money to being broke. That was the first time in my life that I remember I had 10 cents in my bank after I had been working and had been saving and had been responsible with my money. And I felt like such a failure in that moment. But then when I got this judgeship, one of the epiphanies I had was I needed to have been broke with no money in the bank to be able to relate to so many of the people who come before
Who
me.
now appear before you.
Yes,
Yeah.
because honestly, I'm not sure had I not been broke, and when I say broke, I mean broke, like granted, I had family. I knew if I really needed to, I could go stay in my parents' house, but nothing of my own, nothing to show for my Harvard
Hard work.
and my
Yep.
Emory Law School education and all of my hard work. I don't know, had I not experienced what it was like trying to figure out how I can pay, how I can meet my basic needs, if I would be as empathetic on the bench as
Mhm.
now. And so when I look back on all of the drama and trauma I endured, I'm like, but it was getting me ready for this moment so that when these people who come in front of me who are broken in more ways than one, I can better relate to them.
Yeah, mashallah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, Fatima, I noticed that with the exception of your 1 year detour into real estate law and litigation, you've primarily focused on public interest law. I have this image in my head of you going, I'm going to leave real estate. I can't stand it anymore. Um, but you've specifically focused on juveniles in the justice system, both as a prosecutor and as an advocate, and now, of course, as a judge. So, what is it that attracts you to this area of the law? And does your Muslim faith inform how you act as a judge? And if so, in what way?
Well, I'll start by saying, even though I only have one biological child, I have always been in love with children and babies.
Mm.
I was always, um, at the masjid. I was the person when when the mother walked in with the baby, I would run up to her. Can I hold her? Can I hold her? I'll keep her all during Juvenile. Loved babies. I worked every summer in college in a daycare center, and I was assigned to the baby room. So my group were 10 months to 12 months. And I just am amazing with babies. I love them. And so even when I thought I was going to be a doctor, I thought I was going to be a pediatrician. And when I was in college, I did my junior year abroad in Morocco. And my project was to establish a kind of a child care center in a remote village in the middle of the Sahara Desert. And so everything I've always done kind of leading up to that moment had a focus, to this moment has had a focus on children. And so it just really makes sense when I look back over my life that I would end up being a juvenile court judge. I was a child advocate attorney. And, you know, it's hard to explain what that entails, but unless you've done it, it's hard to understand. But child advocate attorneys represent, specifically in Georgia, represent children who have been victims of abuse. So every client I ever had, and I was a child advocate attorney for over 10 years, been severely abused or neglected. And so that's just kind of I do well with children. And that, interestingly, has been one of the hardest parts of Zoom court. Where I suffer and where I feel like I often say my children. When I say my children, I'm referring to the children in my courtroom. My children have suffered because I'm not able to connect with them. Like I normally can connect with them when we're in the same space in a courtroom. It's harder to do that. I can't read the same verbal, you know, the nonverbal.
The body language, because
yes, I can't watch how they respond to their parents. And so that has been challenging, but it's really just been my love of children has just, you know, it just all came together, all of my interests and training together. And certainly I think, you know, of course my faith dictates my path and my choices and my decisions. And I just sort of feel like I kind of just already said, I feel I'm one of those people that believes that God has just always lined things up for me, kind of show me, just kind of steer me onto the path that I should be on. And so I'm very conscious of, even though I'm a judge, trying not to be too judgmental, trying to always put myself in someone else's shoes. And, you know, that's that whole, you know, Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, and that whole in the Quran where it talks about being just, whether it's against the poor, you know, having these standards, whether it's against the poor or the rich, making sure that you, that there's justice, even if it's against your own kinfolk and family. So just constantly keeping those ideas always at the forefront and just trying to be fair, but trying to see myself. And I think I do a good job of that. My deputies always joke that they're like, you don't ever know what judge you're gonna get. One day is Judge Harvard, you know, Judge Ivy League from the Ivy League. The other day is the judge from the hood. And I take that's a compliment to me. You know, I tell them, I like the fact that I know that I can move between both worlds. And I can speak the language. If I need to speak the language to get to a certain type of mama, I can do that. And for me, that is the Islam. That's the Islamic influence of understanding that the community is bigger than the little small insular areas from which we come. This is a global humanity, and this is a global creation, and we serve, all of us are at the mercy of Allah. So I think that's
it. Well, I was going to ask you to explain a little bit about the court system, but now I really feel like I'd like to give the last 10 minutes here to questions from our viewers, listeners. So I'm going to turn it over to Rahma and have her select the questions, and
okay.
we'll go from there.
Well, thank you so much, Judge El-Amin. We have a lot of questions actually, and I think you've
Okay.
answered a couple of them. But one question was about your honors thesis. Do you think that the data on covering will have the same results today?
Probably not. And I say that for a couple of reasons. Well, I guess I need to ask the question, do you mean even if it was the same population? Well, let me just answer it the way probably not, for a few reasons. One, the age of the population has changed. Like I said, when I did that in the early 90s, I was just but a baby. I wasn't even 20 years old. And so most of the grown women who I sampled, were older and had been, were converts to the religion. And now we have a much older Muslim female population, because now it's hard for me to say it. I'm middle age, I'm about to be 46. So I'm middle age, and that's just kind of mind blowing for me. So we've got an older population. More of the Muslim women who would be sampled actually were born into Muslim families. Also, when I was looking at my data, I was sort of surprised looking back at it, the lower income levels. Most of the women that I sampled at that time were earning, I want to say, less than $30,000 a year. And so now we've got, even though many of them had college degrees, so now we've got the demographics of the population, even of that sample, has changed. Also, in the 90s, Imam Muhammad's community, I think he was still alive and kind of was like the central leading figure of that community. And I feel like those masajid are, I don't know how to say it, they're not as quite as engaged. There's some that are, I think, across the board. Some of them have since closed down, have lost significant population. So long story short, I don't think the findings would be the same. It would be fascinating to see what they are, but I think for a number of reasons, they
might be different.
Can you describe some of your favorite things about being a juvenile court judge and some of the hardest cases that you've had to sit for?
Oh, now see, you got to be careful what you ask for, because when I share some of the stories, what made me very conscious of that, one day I was in the hair salon and I was talking to my stylist about a case that I was had just been dealing with that day. And I looked up and she was crying. And so I'm very conscious of that now, because so one of the negative side effects of what I do is I think I do sometimes lose a certain emotional component. And the reality is, you can't do the job that I do if you feel every emotion as probably the typical person would. I would be on the bench bawling, falling over if that were the case, because I'm dealing with children who are raped. I'm dealing with children who rape. I'm dealing with, so I'll give y'all, if you want to know some of the worst, some of the worst cases I've had. I had a 10-month-old baby. That's 10 months. She didn't even know really, she could barely crawl, who had been genitally mutilated. She had, her vagina had been torn apart. Her pinky fingers toes had been dismembered. She had skull fractures throughout her head. She had broken bones, bruises, and there was no good explanation. This was an African-American family. There were multiple children in the home, 2 parents in the home. And this particular baby, to this day, I don't know why she was targeted, but they just routinely abused her and she almost died. And, you know, I think one of my other worst cases, which is also to answer the other part of your question about some of the joys, was a 12-year-old girl who was found in my county during a drug raid. And she was victimized, sexually victimized, and had been
So she had been trafficked, I guess.
She had been trafficked
Mm-hmm.
but in the same spot. I mean,
Yeah.
practically in the same 3 blocks for the last year, but for 2 years, she had been forced to have sex with multiple men. So she started at 10, and the only compensation she received were hot dogs, chips, and drinks. That was it. And that was her life. And when she came into my courtroom, she also, they kept her drugged. So she had no affect. It was like she was lifeless. Like she was sitting in front of me, but she was dead. Mm-hmm. And that to date is my most memorable case. And I took a break during the middle of the hearing, and I had to go back into my chambers and cry. But the reason I still do what I do is because it's not often, but I would say once every 6 weeks, something incredible happens. And one such example is, you know, we put that young girl in treatment. She was in treatment, intensive treatment for 2 to 3 years. You know, life goes on. I'm always getting cases. And one day she showed up unannounced in my courtroom, and she walked in, and I instantly, once I saw who she was, I knew who she was. And she said she was in the neighborhood with her great grandmother. She didn't have any other relatives. She ended up being placed with her great grandmother. And I asked her to stop by so we could see you, because I wanted you to see how well I'm doing and to tell you thank you for everything you did for me. And that is why I do what I do, because there's nothing like truly making a difference in a child's life. And so I'm not gonna glamorize it. That doesn't happen every day. But like I said, I would say usually once every 4 to 6 weeks, something incredible happens. And that's what gives me the strength and the stamina to make it through all those low points and all the abuse that I see on a daily basis.
That must be so hard.
I have, there were a few more questions, but I have one last question that I think would be great for you to answer, because oftentimes non-lawyers don't really understand. So what importance does Sharia law have on our US court system?
Okay, I have to work on. Another thing about my personality is I tend to be just kind of just say it.
I think you have to be. So go ahead.
But everybody can't handle that. I'm working on myself. And I'm telling you something else. I stay in therapy. There's no shame. And I purposely say it when I speak. I have to be in therapy for a number of reasons, because what I learned about myself in doing this work, I thought, oh, it's no big deal. You know, I don't feel it. But what I learned is, no, it's still in here. So I have to be able to have a healthy release. And one of the things that I've also learned in therapy is that everybody can't accept my just matter of fact, blunt, tell it like it is manner, that sometimes I have to, make it palatable. So I guess what I really want to say is there is no place for Sharia in the US government, in the US legal system. That's not to say, and that's a whole nother subject, this was something I spent a lot of time studying in college. I have my own personal thoughts on Sharia. The fact that it was developed 3 centuries after Prophet Muhammad died, that speaks volumes for me. but I will say that no, there really is no place. So for instance, when we have families, polygynous marriages, US law does not acknowledge in any way the second wife. The second wife has zero rights. And so, but that doesn't mean that in your practice of law that you cannot apply Islamic principles. But we're talking about US law acknowledging Sharia, that's not the case.
Thank you. People ask me that all the time, so I wanted to get someone else to answer that.
That was a really great answer. I'm watching the clock here, and I want to be respectful of your time, Judge El-Amin. So can we have just one question, and then we'll let the judge go?
I'm good. I actually had given myself until 1. So,
but we're almost there. Okay,
one more question, just one.
Time.
Okay.
And I think this last question would be great. Was there a struggle making space in a man's world, whether it was as a judge or as a law student or as a lawyer?
Oh gosh. Of course, to this day. So a lot of times I sit in superior court, usually, but pre-pandemic, at least twice a month, I would sit in superior court. And so that's in a separate courthouse. It's not my normal courthouse. In my courthouse, in juvenile court, everybody knows exactly who I am. I kid you not, multiple times, up until the last time I was there, when I walk into, the judges normally have secured entrances and we have separate chambers. So you don't come in where everybody else comes in. And I normally come in my suit, in my dress, dragging my rolling briefcase.
Which is as big as a house.
How many times I've been mistaken for the court reporter. And, it's kind of, it stuns me every single time it happens, because I'm like, are you kidding me right now? Like, you think where's the judge? I'm the judge. Yeah. And so I think, it just shocks me in 2021 that is still the reality. But we are definitely making strides. And I think, now that I'm almost 46, I'm much more comfortable in a patriarchal world than I ever was in my 20s. And so it really, other than shocking me, I never really feel like I don't belong. If you do the work, if you have the credentials and the intelligence and the expertise to back you up, excellence speaks for itself. But, they might not like it, but it does speak for itself.
And one last thing, but your confidence built over the years, though. So
Absolutely.
For some people are like, I'm very introverted. I can't. It's like, that you weren't here when you graduated.
Oh, no. And let me tell you all, I'm an introvert. Now, most people who meet me do not believe that, but if my closest friends and my family will tell you, I'm an introvert. I really don't like speaking in public. I like to just be to myself. I'm a home, but going to Rama's point, it's a skill that I've learned. The only way to survive in the world that I function in and travel in is I had to learn. I got to be able to do it. It's a skill that I have to be able to perfect. So most people who just kind of know me in the professional setting assume I'm an extrovert because I can do the extrovert thing well. But after I get off of this, I'm gonna need like 30 minutes just to be like, okay, just quiet, because it does. It's a skill that you have to build. And in time, you build that confidence and you learn to do things that are uncomfortable for you and are not just in your, that don't just come naturally. And part of growing, my mother used to tell me for women, womanhood starts at age 40. And I used to be like, what the heck are you talking about? But she's right. She's right. It's kind of like, once I hit that threshold of 40, I had a kind of different awakening and realization about who I really was and what I could what I could master. So.
All right. You can have the final word.
I just wanted to say there's so much to talk about and so little time. Thank you again, Judge El-Amin, for being our guest here today, and especially for making time to answer questions from the audience. I just wish we had more time, but this has been wonderful. Thank you so much.
Thank you all so much for having me, and it was my pleasure. And I'm sorry, I saw a bunch of stuff coming up in the chat, but you know, I'm used to in court. I can't look in court. I can't really read the chat because I have going on, so I'm used to ignoring it until the end. So I apologize if anybody was writing me stuff in the chat.
I see that Aisha raised her hand. You have something you want to say, Aisha?
Yeah, honestly, first of all, everyone in this group is just so inspiring to me. I'm going into my senior year of undergrad, and I'm researching law schools and whatnot, and every meeting of LLSP that I go to, I'm like, okay, this is the path, you know. And thank you for answering my question, because it really, every law school that I've been researching so far, it's predominantly male and male faculty, and knowing that there's people out there who have already, you know, shattered that glass ceiling in different parts of the country makes me feel so inspired that maybe I can too, you know. And so yeah, I just wanted to say thank you to all of you, you know, just for your contributions to society and to inspiring people like me. So.
Yalla, inshallah, Aisha Zubair judge in 20 years.
Inshallah.
All right. Well, thank you guys. And I hope everyone has a wonderful day.
Yes, indeed. Ma salama to everybody.
All right, ma salama.